This prominent voice in the Christian community called out something in Christianity that is dangerous, that is toxic, and I don't even think we realize it most of the time. It's something that makes Jesus and Christianity look bad, and guys, it has to stop. I could not agree more with their take on this. So today's video, we're going to be reacting to a video by the Raised to Stay Instagram account that's ran by Natalie Runion. She recently authored a book by the same title, Raised to Stay, and she talks about things in the book like church hurt, spiritual abuse, but also at the same time, the good things that happen in the church and why maybe, just maybe, we don't need to throw out the baby with the bathwater and leave it all together. Either way, if you have been through church hurt or spiritual abuse, no matter where you are, it's actually, I think, a really good read. I can't recommend it enough. It's a short read and an easy read. But today I want to take a look at something that she said. She's recently was on a podcast just in the last couple of weeks, and they talked about kind of some of purity culture and the purity movement of the late 90s and early 2000s. That's a hot button issue, but she talked about it. Not everybody's going to agree. But what really got her frustrated was the response that she got from Christians. Again, this toxic kind of response that we have to stop, okay? There's something missing in a lot of our Christian responses that we desperately need to get. So let's go ahead. We'll watch this video together. I'll stop it a few times. We'll talk in and out through it. But again, I couldn't agree more with Natalie. I think this is a fantastic point, and this is something that we all need to hear. So please watch it all the way through, because the stuff that we're reacting to at the end of the video is really where the lessons come that we all have to learn if we want to look and act most like Jesus.
Hey Stayers, so this week has been interesting because we've gotten into the debate of modesty culture, true love waits, I kiss dating goodbye, and how for some of you it was the best thing that ever happened to you and you wish that everybody still did it, and for others of you, you were abused by that system.
Okay, so she's talking about on this podcast, modesty culture, true love waits, I kiss dating goodbye. If you were around church, if you were around especially youth groups in the late 90s, early 2000s, and you know all about those things, some people have great experiences with them. Some people had terrible experiences with them. Okay, some people, these things, this kind of purity culture really helped set their life on a different trajectory. Okay, it's helped their marriages, all this sort of things. For others, it's caused damage and undue guilt and shame around sex and around, relationships. So I've heard from people on both sides. I've seen the good, I've seen the bad, but there's definitely some damage here, even if you haven't experienced it.
By leaders who took advantage of it. And I have to say that I did not come out physically, emotionally, or sexually damaged by any of these movements, though I did struggle with other things as a result of some of these movements.
So Natalie's not had a super bad experience. So when she was talking about this on the podcast, she's not talking out of a place of bitterness or out of a place of deep pain. Her experience was kind of middle of the road with these things, but she has seen enough with her work around church hurt and spiritual abuse to know that the purity culture did cause damage. So again, she's not coming from a place of heavy brokenness or bitterness as she's talking about this. It's just talking about this on a podcast conversation. It ruffled a lot of feathers. And as you're about to see next, the Christian response was not healthy. The Christian response did not look like Jesus. Instead, the best way I know how to describe it is it was a toxic response. There's a lot that we can learn here.
Because there was so much shame attached to it. But besides the movement, I think the thing that grieves my heart the most is that as Christians...
All right, so I want to talk about that. I think that word choice is really powerful. The thing that grieves my heart the most, what she's about to talk about, she says it grieves her. It deeply saddens her. And I feel the same way. I think that's one of the best word choices that I've heard, because I get so deeply grieved and I get so sad and so upset and so frustrated when I see Christians react this way. And I see this all the time on social media. I see this all the time, not only with other people's stories, other people on social media, our social media, but I see this in real life with people all the time when they go through church hurt, spiritual abuse, and when they need the church most. These toxic responses just run people away from Jesus with no one to help them. So again, I think that's a great word choice, because I feel the same way. It absolutely grieves me. I think it should grieve you too.
The most is that as Christians, we lack all empathy when it comes to people who have experienced the church, religion, or religious movements differently than we have. So it's on both sides, right? So if a church has hurt me, then I can't understand how a church would not hurt someone. If the church has not hurt me, then I can't imagine how the church would hurt someone. And rather than...
All right, so she says, here's the big toxic problem. Christians, in our response, we tend to, she said lack all empathy. I don't think we lack all empathy. I think Christians, we tend to lose all empathy when we come up against someone who's had a very different church experience than us. And this could go beyond churches. This could be someone who has a very different political experience than us. It could be someone who has a very different experience in a variety of things. But I see this a lot when it comes to stuff like church hurt, when it comes to spiritual abuse stuff in the church movement. So she gave two examples here that I have seen a ton of. If you've been deeply church hurt, you've been spiritually abused, then you have a really hard time believing that everybody hasn't been hurt, hasn't been spiritually abused, or believing that they won't be, right? So we tend to attack people and lose all empathy with people who still go to that church or people who still take up for that church that hurt us or abused us. Same thing with the movement, like the purity culture movement here. And if we haven't been church hurt, we have an extremely difficult time understanding how other people have been church hurt and spiritually abused the way that they have. And a lot of times we don't just lose our empathy, but we actually start questioning if they're telling the truth. And here's where this gets to be the biggest deal. This is most difficult and I believe most dangerous when someone who you know and you care for in your church comes forward and says they've experienced spiritual abuse or church hurt. Because if that's not your experience, if you've had a great, fantastic experience at your church, then there's going to be a lot of cognitive dissonance that you have to deal with when someone who you know says they've had a completely different experience. So oftentimes what we do, we get mad because we say, that's not my experience. That's not the pastor that I know. That's not the leadership that I know. That's not the ministry that I know. And instead of sitting down, showing empathy, curiosity, love, and listening to this person's story, this person who is deeply hurt and is really struggling, instead of listening to them, oftentimes we put them on the defensive. We start asking them 1,000 questions. We start trying to prove why what their experience or what they say about their experience isn't right. And it's almost like we put them on trial and they have to prove to us why they're right. And I've seen this. I've even experienced this where close friends have been separated because one experienced church hurt or spiritual abuse. And instead of listening, the friend simply said, hey, I'm going to kind of attack this. I'm going to ask you not to talk about this because it's not been my experience and I'm staying at this church. And because of that, it separates brothers, it separates sisters. And here's what's even more damaging about that. When we don't listen, we don't learn. And we can't fix any problems that may be in the church. When we do listen, you may not agree with every person that says. You may not agree with every part of the experience that they have had. But if you will listen, likely there is something real and tangible there. Even if you don't agree with everything, there's something real and tangible there that has happened that needs to be addressed and we can learn from it. If nothing else, by listening, loving, and showing empathy, we keep that relationship open so that we can continue to love that brother, that sister, back to Christ. So whether you have been church hurt and spiritually abused and you get frustrated and lack empathy with everybody in the church, everybody who hasn't experienced that, who isn't jaded like maybe you or I may be about some things, right? Who doesn't have those triggers, or whether you're the person who's never experienced church hurt or spiritual abuse. Your church has been phenomenal and you struggle to have empathy with that person who has been church hurt. One of the greatest things that we could do is find our empathy again. And instead of arguing with people, getting frustrated, asking a bunch of questions, if our first response could be an empathetic and listening response, we would look a ton more like Jesus. I love this. Great job so far.
And rather than sit in the tension of that, I wonder what this person has lived through and gone through, we turn to, well, that's not right. That's not true. I don't understand. And we get very up.
All right, so this is really good. She says, instead of sitting in this tension of, I have had a great experience at this church, and this other person has been church hurt or spiritually abused. Or sitting in the tension of, I had a terrible experience at this church, yet this person's had nothing but a great experience. Instead of sitting in that tension, holding that two things can be true at the same time for two separate people, we start saying things like, well, that can't be true. I've not experienced that, so that can't be true. Or that couldn't have happened because I haven't seen any of those red flags. And what we do, again, instead of showing empathy, we completely dismiss what the other person has experienced. And that causes a whole lot of damage. One of the things that we can learn from this, and I love that word choice, because if you've been around Church Disrupted for any time at all, we talk about tensions a lot. Tensions from the Bible, tensions from the world and our experiences. We can have different experiences. And when we hold those tensions and we don't let those tensions scare us, there's so much that we can learn from those. We can get a ton better. So she says, instead of holding that tension, though, we really struggle. I love this next part.
Oh, I don't understand. And we get very up on our high horse and we get very Pharisee. Okay.
We get very up on our high horse and we get very Pharisee. When someone has a different experience we haven't had, it frustrates us. It scares us. If we could be honest, we react this way because it scares us to think that someone else has had that bad experience in church, or it scares us to think that it was just us and that church could be good for everyone else. When that scares us, we get up on our high horse, we start looking down on people, and our Pharisee comes out. And I need you to hear this because this is huge. When our Pharisee comes out, nothing good is going to come out of us. I'm going to say that again. When our Pharisee comes out, our inner Pharisee, when our inner Pharisee comes out, nothing good will come out of us. All we'll do is judge people. All we'll do is dismiss people. We will win arguments and we will lose relationships over those arguments. So, hey, we got to make sure that we don't let our inner Pharisee lead instead of empathy. When empathy comes out, good things are going to come out of us. When our Pharisee comes out, nothing good is going to come out of us.
Okay. I want to remind all of us that just because it didn't happen to you does not mean that it didn't happen to someone else. And to diminish other people's experiences is not Christ-like. And we need to do a better job of leaning in and listening.
All right. So I think that was incredible. She said, I want to remind you, just because it didn't happen to you doesn't mean that it didn't happen to someone else. Just because it's not your experience doesn't mean it's not their experience. And we need to do a better job of leaning in, listening, leading with empathy, love, curiosity. And I couldn't agree more. We look most like Jesus when we lead with empathy, love, and curiosity. And I have people, especially on social media, with what we do with the podcast, a lot of the clips that we're posting on social media, I have people who react all the time. And one of the number one things that I say to these negative reactions is, hey, could I encourage you to lead with a little bit more empathy and a little bit more curiosity next time, okay? Sometimes I'll have people argue with me. They will fight with me only for a couple of hours later and a few comments later to come back and say, oh, actually, we agree. I misunderstood, right? But beyond me, I've seen this happen with so many men and women who love Jesus, who love the church. They get deeply hurt. And when they talk about the hurt they've experienced, worse, when they talk about the spiritual or sexual abuse that they've experienced, instead of people listening to them, hearing them, and helping them heal, that they were dismissed, they were silenced, they were shut up. And I've experienced this even recently. Saw some friends just yesterday at an event who didn't even want to talk to us. Nothing has happened between us and them to hurt our relationship, but they didn't even want to talk to us because they still go to a church where they've had great experiences. And that's a church where we experienced church hurt, spiritual abuse, and had to call them out publicly. And simply because of that, they don't even feel like they can be around us without a fight or without trying to move us to another point, without trying to tell us why we're wrong. So, hey, if there's one thing that you can learn from this video, and I think this is huge, we need to learn as Christians to lead with empathy. We need to listen before we jump to conclusions. We need to listen and understand before we react, because when we do that, we'll look more like Jesus than ever before. And guys, the world doesn't need our conclusions. The world doesn't need us to tell them why they're wrong. Our brothers and sisters who are hurt don't need us to tell them why they're wrong, right? People who are still in the churches we've been hurt by don't need us to tell them why they need to leave that church. Instead, what they need is they need a listening ear. They need a brother or sister walking in good relationship with them. And when we lead with empathy, when we lead with love, we will look like Jesus. And I don't know about you, but I want to look like Jesus, especially in a world that needs Jesus so desperately.